All right, folks. Imagine this, right? You're in a country like ours where everyone's looking for justice, and you've got someone accused of a pretty serious drug charge, but they're trying to cut a deal to avoid the full force of the law. They want to negotiate their fate, kind of sidestep the whole prosecution process.
Mm.
Now, what happens if the judge overseeing the trial and even the Court of Appeals agree with this move, but then the state prosecutor steps in and says, hold on a minute, this isn't right? Well, you've got a clash, a legal showdown, and that's exactly what happened in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And today, on the Deep Dive, we're going to dig deep, real deep into this Supreme Court decision. A decision that shines a light, a really bright light on the roles and responsibilities within our justice system, especially when it comes to fighting illegal drugs.
Absolutely. This case is a real nail-biter.
It is. It's a fascinating one.
It really is, and it brings up some super important questions about how our courts work and how the whole system is designed to handle drug offenses.
So today, we're diving headfirst into the Supreme Court's ruling on whether a prosecutor needs to agree, actually give their consent, for a plea bargain to be valid in a drug case.
Yeah, that's the crux of it. And the case that really brought this to the forefront is People of the Philippines versus Naci Borras y Lascano. You got that right.
That's it. You got it.
All right, good. So our goal today, our mission, if you will, is to help you understand the critical role that prosecutors play in this whole plea bargain process, especially when it comes to drug offenses.
Right. And we're going to break down the implications of this particular Supreme Court decision.
It's a big one.
It is a big one, and it has a lot of nuances to it that we really want to unpack for our listeners. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the case, let's make sure everyone's on the same page here. We're looking at the Supreme Court's decision in the case of People of the Philippines versus Naci Borras y Lascano.
Yeah, that's the one, GR No 250295, and this decision came out on March 15th, 2021.
2021, that's right.
So relatively recent. And to really appreciate how the Supreme Court arrived at their conclusion, we need to walk through how this case played out in the lower courts first. You know, it's like understanding the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. It's all about the journey. And this journey begins in Naga City back in March of 2017. Our main character in this legal drama is a man named Naci Borras y Lascano, and he was accused of some pretty serious offenses. He was charged with selling a tiny amount of shabu, we're talking 0.032 grams, like really small, and then possessing a slightly larger amount, 0.165 grams.
Right. And these charges, they fall under Sections 5 and 11 of Republic Act 9165, also known as RA 9165, which is the kind of like the big law, the big kahuna of drug laws of the Philippines.
It's the one everyone refers to.
Exactly. And of course, it's been amended a few times over the years, so we have to be mindful of that too.
Oh, absolutely. And so Borras, at the beginning, he says, not guilty. He pleads not guilty to both these charges.
Yeah, the classic not guilty plea.
And that's when the trial gets rolling.
And as the trial's going on, something really major happens in the Philippine legal landscape. August 2017, the Supreme Court drops this bombshell decision, Estepona v. Labrigo.
This is a big one.
Huge.
Huge case.
So what they do is they declare Section 23 of RA 9165 unconstitutional. Now, why is this so important?
That's the million-dollar question right there.
Section 23 was the part of the law that basically said, no plea bargains in drug cases. Full stop. No way, no how. So the Supreme Court saying, Newton, that's unconstitutional, was a massive shift. They basically asserted their power over procedure, over how court cases are run. And they said this blanket ban on plea bargaining, it steps on our toes, it messes with the balance of power in the legal system.
You're absolutely right. This rulemaking power is like the Supreme Court saying, hey, we set the rules for how things operate in the courts, not Congress. It's about maintaining the independence of the judiciary.
Right on.
And so Estepona v. Labrigo really shook things up because now suddenly plea bargaining was back on the table for drug cases, like the door swung wide open.
Yeah, it was a game changer.
Big time.
And in the wake of that decision, both the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and the Supreme Court itself, they're like, okay, we need some guidelines here. We need some rules for this new plea bargaining landscape.
Right, because, you know, you can't just have this free-for-all.
Chaos.
Chaos, exactly. So the DOJ comes out with Department Circular No. 06117 in November 2017, and then the Supreme Court follows suit with AM number 180316 SC in April 2018. These are the rule books for how plea bargaining is supposed to work.
Exactly. Now, here's a key detail, a little wrinkle. The initial DOJ circular, that 06117, it actually didn't allow for plea bargaining when it came to violations of Section 5. Remember, that was one of the charges against Borras, that illegal sale of drugs charge.
Yeah.
So even though plea bargaining was technically allowed, there were still some limitations, some cases where it was off the table.
Right. It wasn't a completely open door. It was more like, a door that was ajar with some restrictions.
Ajar.
Ajar.
I like that.
So Borras, he's in the middle of his trial, and these rules are changing and evolving around him. So what does he do?
What any savvy defendant would do, he sees an opportunity.
He makes a move.
He makes a move. In May of 2018, he throws out this plea bargaining proposal. He says, okay, I'm willing to plead guilty, but not to the original charges. I'll plead guilty to 2 counts of illegal possession of drug paraphernalia. That's Section 12 of RA 9165, which, by the way, is a much less serious offense.
Right. And the prosecution, they're obviously not thrilled about this.
Oh, they're not happy.
No. They object right away, and they point right back to that DOJ circular 06117, the one that said no plea bargains for illegal sale of drugs.
Right. They're playing by the rule book as it stood at that time.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where it gets even more complicated.
Oh, and there's more.
Oh, there's more. Just a month later, the DOJ issues yet another circular, Department Circular, 02718.
Oh, boy. Keeping up with these circulars is a job in itself.
It is. It is. And this new circular, it changes the guidelines again. It amends the previous ones, but it still has some specific rules for plea bargaining in cases involving Section 5 violations, that illegal sale charge. So you can see how this whole legal landscape is kind of like shifting sand under Borras' feet.
Yeah, very unstable ground.
Very unstable.
It makes you wonder, how are the lower courts going to deal with this? How do they handle this plea bargain proposal with all these changing rules?
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. The trial court, the regional trial court in Naga City, Branch 61, they actually went ahead and granted Borras' plea bargain. They said, yes, you can plead guilty to the lesser offenses, even though the prosecution was like, no way, we object.
Wow, they went against the prosecution. That's bold.
It was a bold move. But wait, there's more? The trial court didn't stop there.
Of course not.
They went even further. On their own initiative, and this is a fancy legal term, motu proprio, meaning like, we're taking the reins here. They decided to declare the DOJ circulars, both 06117 and 02718, and even a related order from the Regional Prosecution Office, unconstitutional. They basically said, these DOJ rules, they're not valid.
They really threw down the gauntlet.
They did. And their reasoning was fascinating. They argued that these DOJ circulars were stepping on the Supreme Court's toes, that they went against the whole point of the Estepona decision, that they contradicted the Supreme Court's own guidelines in AM Inter 1803-16 SC.
They were like, hey, DOJ, you're messing with the Supreme Court's turf here.
Exactly. You can't just make rules that contradict what the Supreme Court has already said. And they even threw in that these DOJ circulars violated the Equal Protection Clause, which is a big deal. It's a fundamental legal principle. So the trial court is saying, because these DOJ rules are invalid, we don't need the prosecutor's permission for this plea bargain. We're good to go.
So they really sided with Borras on this one.
They did. They said, okay, let's move forward. So a few days later, on July 23, 2018, Borras is back in court. He's rearraigned, and he pleads guilty to those 2 lesser charges of illegal possession of drug paraphernalia. And then, about a month later, on August 31st, 2018, the trial court officially finds him guilty of those lesser offenses.
Case closed, right?
And not so fast.
There's always another chapter.
Always another chapter. The prosecution's like, nope, we're not letting this go. They appeal the trial court's decision, and this is where the Court of Appeals comes in.
So now we're moving up the judicial ladder.
Exactly. And the Court of Appeals, in their decision, which came out on October 28, 2019, in case number CAGR SP 1599780, they actually agreed with the trial court on one key point. They upheld the decision to allow the plea bargain. They said, yeah, the plea bargain can stand. But they did have one major disagreement with the trial court.
Uh-oh, here we go again.
Here we go again.
What did they disagree on?
They said, you went too far by declaring the DOJ circulars unconstitutional.
Ah, okay, so they kind of pulled him back a bit.
They did. They said, look, trial court, you can't just declare things unconstitutional like that. That's a bit overreach, a little out of your lane.
Judicial power trip.
A little bit.
So they removed that part of the trial court's ruling, but they still allowed the plea bargain. That's interesting. What was their logic there?
Their reasoning is really important, I think, for understanding the complexities of this case. They pointed to a Supreme Court resolution that was issued on April 2, 2019. This resolution dealt with a plea bargaining framework that had been proposed by the Philippine Judges Association. And the Court of Appeals interpreted this resolution to mean that judges did have the power to approve a plea bargain, even if the prosecutor objected to it, if the prosecutor's only reason for objecting was just to, support the government's anti-drug campaign in a general sense.
So they're saying, look, if the prosecutor doesn't have a really solid, specific reason for rejecting this plea bargain, then the judge can step in and say, we're doing this anyway.
Exactly. And the Court of Appeals went on to say, look, the prosecution hasn't shown us that Borras is a repeat offender or a habitual drug user or someone who's known to cause trouble. They also noted that there was no information about whether he'd gone through rehab or anything like that. So in their view, there wasn't a strong enough reason to say no to the plea bargain.
Right. So they're hinting that maybe, just maybe, the prosecutor's consent shouldn't be an absolute requirement in every single case.
Right. It's a very nuanced argument. So we've got this back and forth between the lower courts. The trial court says yes to the plea bargain. The prosecution appeals. The Court of Appeals says yes to the plea bargain, but you can't say the DOJ's circulars are unconstitutional. And all this sets the stage for the big showdown in the Supreme Court.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. And this is where the Supreme Court has to wrestle with the fundamental question. In drug cases, does the prosecutor always have to agree for a plea bargain to be valid?
The million-dollar question.
The million-dollar question. And this is the heart of People of the Philippines versus Naci Borras y Lascano.
So what did the highest court in the land have to say about all of this?
Well, in their decision, which they handed down on March 15th, 2021, the Supreme Court sided with the prosecution. They said, you know what? The prosecutor's consent is really important. It's not something we can just brush aside.
They put their foot down.
They put their foot down. They granted the petition that was filed by the people of the Philippines, and they reversed what the Court of Appeals had decided.
Okay, so they're overturning the lower court's ruling.
They are. And that means they also had to invalidate Borras's guilty pleas to those lesser offenses.
Right.
So that whole plea bargain that he'd managed to get through the lower courts, it's all gone. It's wiped off the slate. And the Supreme Court didn't stop there. They remanded the case, which means they sent it back down to the regional trial court. They said, okay, you guys need to start over and proceed with the original charges, the violations of sections 5 and 11 of RA 9165.
Wow. So back to square one for Borras.
Back to square one.
So the Supreme Court clearly comes down firmly on the side of prosecutorial discretion in this case.
Absolutely.
Right.
And they laid out their reasoning very clearly. They referred to Section 2, Rule 116 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure. Now, this rule, it specifically states that for someone to plead guilty to a lesser offense and for that plea to be considered valid, you need two things. You need the consent of the offended party, which in criminal case is the state, represented by the prosecutor, and you need the consent of the prosecutor themselves.
Right. It's like a double check, like the state and the prosecutor are both saying, yes, this plea bargain is okay with us.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court emphasized this point by saying that the state, through the prosecutor, is the one who's responsible for enforcing the laws. The prosecutor acts on behalf of the public, whose interests have been harmed by the crime that was committed.
And the court also drew on some pretty important precedents.
They did, yeah.
They cited cases like People v. Villarama Jr., which goes back to 1992, and Serra v. Zenos, which was decided in 2020. These cases both made it very clear that accepting a plea to a lesser offense, it's not some automatic right that the accused has. It's not like, oh, I want to plead guilty to this lesser charge, therefore I can.
It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
No. And the courts have to use their judgment.
It's up to their discretion.
But that discretion hinges on getting that consent from both the prosecutor and the offended party. It's not just the judge calling the shots.
And the Supreme Court, in the Borras case, they really hammered home the point that the prosecutor has a unique and crucial role in the whole criminal justice system. They have full control over how criminal cases are prosecuted. They have the duty to figure out what the right charge is based on the evidence they have. And they have to be careful not to charge someone with something lesser than what they deserve or something more serious than what the evidence supports. It's a very, very delicate balance.
It's finding that sweet spot.
Finding that sweet spot.
And it's a big responsibility.
It is. It is. And the Supreme Court in this case, they were very clear that the trial court had overstepped its bounds. They made a mistake by ignoring the prosecutor's objection. They said, look, you can't just do that. You have to have that agreement between both sides, or you need to continue the trial based on the original, more serious charges.
So the message here is that cooperation is key. The different parts of the justice system have to work together.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court didn't stop there. They addressed this very practical question of what happens if someone pleads guilty to a lesser charge without the prosecutor's consent. What's the consequence of that? And they pointed to a very specific rule, Section 7, Rule 117 of the Rules on Criminal Procedure, which says that if you're convicted based on an invalid plea, that doesn't prevent you from being prosecuted again for the original, more serious offense.
Oh, wow.
So that's a pretty big deal.
That's a huge incentive to get things right the first time around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So by emphasizing this rule, the Supreme Court is basically saying, look, following the correct procedure when it comes to plea bargains is really, really important.
Don't cut corners.
Don't cut corners, exactly. And the Supreme Court, they also addressed those DOJ circulars that we were talking about earlier, the ones on plea bargaining. Remember those?
Oh, yeah. The ever-changing guidelines.
Ever-changing guidelines. And they reaffirmed what they'd already said in that Sayre case, that DOJ Circular Navo 02718, the one that came out in 2018, that it didn't actually change or repeal the plea bargaining framework that the Supreme Court itself had set out in AM number 180316SC. They said, look, the DOJ circular, that's just an internal guideline for prosecutors. It doesn't change the rules of court procedure.
So the Supreme Court was like, we're the bosses when it comes to procedure in the courts, not the DOJ.
Exactly. They were like, we set the ground rules.
So they really drew a line in the sand there.
They did. So to sum it all up for our listeners, the Supreme Court's decision in People of the Philippines versus Naci Borras y Lascano, it basically reaffirms something really fundamental. It says that the prosecutor's consent is absolutely essential for a plea bargain to be valid, especially in cases that involve drugs.
They're not messing around when it comes to drugs.
They're not messing around. And this decision, it really underscores that separation of powers that we have in our government. The executive branch, through the prosecutor, is responsible for making sure that the laws are enforced, and the judiciary, the courts, they can approve plea bargains, but they can't just do whatever they want.
Right. They have to work within the system, and they have to respect the role of the prosecutor.
They do. They do.
And, thinking about it, this case has implications that go far beyond just this one guy, Borras, and his plea bargain. It really speaks to the broader issue of balance in our criminal justice system. It highlights that while the courts are obviously essential for administering justice, the responsibility for deciding which charges to bring against someone, that rests primarily with the prosecution.
And it's a huge responsibility.
It is. And imagine if judges could just accept plea bargains whenever they wanted to, even if the prosecutor was dead set against it. It could really undermine the whole framework of our legal system.
Absolutely. It's a very, very complex system with a lot of moving parts.
It is. It is.
So for our listeners out there, after hearing about this case, what do you think? What are your thoughts on how this decision affects the balance between what a judge can decide, the power of the prosecutor, and the rights of the accused? We really want to hear your perspective on this landmark ruling.
Yeah, jump into the comments. Tell us what you think.
Hit that favorite button. Share it with your friends. We want to get a conversation going. And for those of you who are taking notes or maybe just want a quick recap of the key legal takeaways from this case, here's a rundown. First, you've got the indispensability of prosecutors' consent in plea bargaining. That's a mouthful, but it basically means that for a guilty plea to a lesser offense to be valid, the prosecutor has to agree. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Right. That's the bottom line.
Second, you've got the limited discretion of trial courts. Trial courts, they do have some leeway when it comes to plea bargains, but they can't just do whatever they want. They need to get consent from both the prosecutor and the person or entity that was harmed by the crime. Third, we have the crucial role of the prosecutor. The prosecutor is the one calling the shots when it comes to deciding what the right charge is and how a case should be prosecuted. And they do that based on the evidence they have.
And last but not least, those DOJ circulars that we talked about, they're not laws. They're more like guidelines.
Internal guidelines.
Yeah, exactly. They don't overrule the Supreme Court's power to set the rules for how things work in the courts.
So there you have it, folks. That's our deep dive into a really important and complex Supreme Court decision.
A real head-scratcher.
It is. It's one of those cases that really makes you think about the intricacies of our legal system. If you enjoyed this kind of analysis, if you're interested in learning more about the cases that shape our society and our lives, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're here to bring you in-depth discussions on all sorts of fascinating legal issues.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.
Until